Hi, it's Tom here. And before we get into this episode of Last Orders, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our listeners and readers who generously donate to us, either monthly or whenever you can. Spiked is free, we want to keep it free, and we rely on the generosity of our readers and listeners to do so. So to those who already give, thank you. And to those who don't, please do consider giving whatever you can, whenever you can, to keep Spiked going and growing. To do so, you just have to go to spiked-online.com, hit the big red donate button in the top right of the homepage, and fill in your details. Thanks again. Now, on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, Spike's Nanny State podcast. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and this is the show where myself and Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs discuss all the latest news in public health killjoyism, all with the help of an invited guest. Today, we're joined by talkRADIO breakfast show host Julia Hartley-Brewer to discuss Canada and cannabis legalisation, Theresa May's prohibitionist legacy, and how the sugar tax ruined Irn-Bru. Hello and welcome to Last Orders, Spike's Nanny State podcast. My name's Tom Slater, and today, as ever, I'm joined by Chris Snowdon, the IEA's Director of Lifestyle Economics. Hello, Chris.
Hiya.
And today we are delighted to be joined by talkRADIO breakfast host, journalist and broadcaster, and great friend of the show, Julia Hartley-Brewer. How are you doing, Julia?
Thank you very much. What a welcome.
So to kick things off, let's talk about cannabis. So 3 British MPs have predicted that cannabis could be legalised in Britain within 5 to 10 years. This comes after the 3 MPs, David Lammy, Norman Lamb and Jonathan Ginogly, went on a fact-finding trip to Canada. Canada, of course, legalised cannabis last year. So today we want to ask, is cannabis legalisation in Britain actually on the horizon? What can we learn from Canada if we do decide to do it? And if we are on the edge of doing this, what about the concerns that have dominated this discussion for so long about mental health in particular? Have we got sufficient answers to the challenges of opponents of legalisation, one of which I think is Julia here? So, Chris, to kick things off, you were actually on this little druggy getaway with these MPs. You want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, certainly. So this was last month. It was organised by VotFast, the drug reform organisation. And it was all about just seeing what the market is like in Canada. It was legalised October the 17th last year. And we really saw a lot. You know, we saw the factories where they make it on industrial scale. We went to an Indian reservation where they kind of make it on a more organic scale, but sell it in a bit more of a commercial scale, funnily enough, than the legal shops, which we also visited in a much more kind of clinical. You got plain packaging and stuff like this, very, very highly regulated. And we spoke to politicians and policemen and so on, and they were all basically fairly enthusiastic about it. But we also had a presentation from the people at Statistics Canada who have been covering the cannabis market very carefully. And it's very clear that the vast bulk of cannabis being sold is still being sold on the black market. And it's not rocket science to work out why. I mean, the average gram of cannabis in the legal recreational shops is going for about $10 Canadian, and it's about $6 or $7 on the street. And it does seem actually as if they've had quite a few people try cannabis for the first time since legalization. I dare say a lot of them will probably never try it again. Just a novelty aspect of it, but still a good few 100,000 people seem to have tried it for the first time, and they're buying it from the legal shops. Presumably they were deterred before from getting involved with, buying drugs on the street, or they didn't trust the quality of it. But it seems like the vast majority of people have been using it for a long time, which in Canada is a lot of people and very high prevalence. I mean, where we were in Ontario, it's 20%, kind of fairly regular users of cannabis. All those people, well, most of those people are still buying it on the street, mainly because it's much cheaper. So until they get the price down to at least the same level as the black market, they're always going to have a very, very big problem with the illicit trade. And there's no reason it can't be done. The only reason the prices are so high in the legit shops is taxation and massive over-regulation and an incredible lack of competition. I mean, in Toronto, you've got 3 million people, you've got 4 shops. This Indian reservation we went to has got a population of 4,000 people, they've got 19 shops. So they've got a long way to go. It's very encouraging, and it's very encouraging that the MPs basically seem to come around to the idea. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned about how to do it properly.
Julie, what's your take on all this? Do you think we're 5-10 years away? And if so, is that a good thing?
Probably closer to 10 than 5. I had to point out that David Lammy was on this trip. And if David Lammy says something is happening, as a general rule, it probably isn't going to happen. But leave that aside. Norman Lamb's a rather sensible soul on these things. I think inevitably we are going that way. I think the pressure of big business, the pressure of governments from the middle classes who basically say, well, I smoked cannabis when I was younger. It was fine. Not the skunk that's on the streets now, but also the fear of having their delightful children being criminalised in the current criminal justice system. There are so many pressures moving towards this. The government wants to tax it. The police would really like not to have this on the statute books. You can free up lots of prison space because you're not having to deal with people who are not behind bars because they're possessing cannabis, but because they're dealing it. You can probably find an awful lot of people who'd be in favour of this. I still am not. I still generally think, as a general rule, as a good middle-class hypocrite that I am, that the drugs we've already got, the legal ones we've got, like alcohol, are enough already, thank you very much. We don't need any more. And I'm just not entirely sure it's a good idea. Although Chris's arguments about, the need to sort of regulate it, and I've heard you in a previous podcast talking about things like the only reason skunk exists is because the organised criminals bringing it in and creating it. Of course, they want to do much stronger drugs. People don't know what they're buying. It was causing the psychosis, all the problems we've got. And actually, if people could just go to a shop, buy it legally, wouldn't get involved with the criminals, we could, sort out the organised criminals, and everyone would have a lower dose, and it would all be fine. I just don't think it's going to work out like that. However, I am willing to look and wait and see what the evidence is from places like Canada, from the US states where it's been legalised. I'd like to see in 5 years' time what is happening. How many more people or fewer people are using drugs? Have you dealt with the organised crime aspects? Have you seen criminality go down? I have a funny feeling that, again, for the same reason as you said, Chris, that, look, you're always going to be able to buy it cheaper on the streets than in a regulated shop where it's taxed, in which case there's always going to be an illicit market. And all you do is just create a legal market on top of the illegal market. There you're back to square one.
You're not always going to have an illegal market. There's no reason whatsoever that the legal market, with all the economies of scale of industrial production, not having to dodge the cops and not get your stuff seized every now and again, there's no reason at all why it shouldn't be significantly cheaper. It's only governments getting in the way with so many barriers to entry and so many regulations, and in a lot of US states, ridiculously high taxation. I mean,
the governments are not going to legalise it unless they can have ridiculously high levels of taxation.
Well, I don't know.
80% on a packet of cigarettes, they're going to want to be doing the same with cannabis, aren't they?
Well, I don't know if you can go quite that high, but I mean, I did some kind of modelling on this last year, and I worked out that you could have a 30% tax plus VAT, which is a lot of money. You bring in about £700 million a year just from the excise tax, and it would still be a lot cheaper than the market price at the moment.
The question is what the organised criminals turn to do, because as we boosted up the punishments for illicit drug supply, they've turned to people trafficking. So we've actually seen a worse crime being developed. I wonder, though, if you did make cannabis legal, and I can absolutely see there are arguments for that, certainly in making it safer for people who are going to use it anyway, absolutely. But I would worry about organised criminals then turning to the drugs that were still illegal, unless you think that we would then move on to legalising coke, crack, heroin, everything else.
Well, that's what you want.
Revolution.
I hear this argument a lot about, well, the criminals just do something else. I mean, it's not our job to give criminals lucrative sidelines for a start, but secondly, they can get into the other drugs as much as they like. They can't actually force people to take them. There's a lot more demand for cannabis than there is for the other drugs. Yeah. And if you're some cannabis dealer who goes out of business as a result of legalization, well, hopefully for a start, if you will actually just move into the legal market, which is what does generally tend to happen. And if you try and move into the methamphetamine market, then, good luck building up a big client base, because most people are just not interested whatsoever.
Yeah. But I'm completely aware of my hypocrisy on this. And again, we saw that, didn't we, at the Tory leadership contest? These admissions. I mean, virtually everyone was saying, oh, I sniffed glue. Everyone was doing everything.
Full spectrum,
I don't know what I've been doing with my life, frankly. And yet everyone was sitting there saying, well, of course, Rory Stewart shouldn't go to jail for all these years. Maybe we just need to be more honest about our criminal justice system, because we all talk about how the war on drugs has failed. I'm with Peter Hitchens on this, almost alone on this issue, that we never really had a war on drugs. But we could at least, at the very least, I think, decriminalise and stop pretending that we are actually making criminals of people who are possessing for their own personal use. It's quite clear. You look at what goes on at music festivals now and on the streets. You smell cannabis all the time on the streets in major cities now. In which case, there's no point having a law that is made a mockery of. You may as well get rid of the law unless you're going to enforce it. And again, I don't do drugs. Never had any interest in drugs. Would rather my daughter in the years to come doesn't do drugs. Would I want her to get a criminal record for trying cannabis? No.
And Chris, on this point of has the war on drugs ever actually been fought, particularly in relation to cannabis? Because, there is dated less on the cannabis question, but, if you think about Japan, if you think about places like South Korea, very punitive responses to things like drug possession. They do have something like a tenth of the drug deaths that we have. Is there anything to that argument that, if we did enforce the laws, then we would see a slightly different outcome? Or is the question not really about that? It's about, the sort of society we want to live in, what we want to criminalise and what we don't.
No, I just think the argument's wrong. I think people are cherry-picking places like Japan, which have never had much of a drug culture, and ignoring loads of other places that have really tried extremely hard to clamp down on the war on drugs. The Philippines, the USA, Iran, plenty of countries have fought the war on drugs more fiercely than Japan has, and have failed. Comprehensively failed, and we're talking over a period of a century. So, you won't get any argument from me if you say that over the course of the last 20 years or so, the police haven't made much of an effort to enforce the cannabis laws in particular. But there's still tens of thousands of cautions, at least, and a lot of criminal records being created. And David Lammy would say quite rightly that the cannabis laws are used disproportionately to nail black people, and that Julia's daughter is very unlikely actually to get arrested. But people around Tottenham, people in Tottenham are really quite likely to get a criminal record.
The liberal argument, which you've been making over the years, which I'm definitely coming around to this idea that, look, unless it's something that causes harm to other people, people should be allowed to do what they want to do, whether that's eat yourself into oblivion, drink yourself to oblivion, smoke yourself, or do drugs into oblivion. That should be your choice. I suppose I get a bit nanny state about, when teenagers are doing it, or when it afflicts people who are from the bottom rungs of society more than on the top rungs. But I'm certainly more and more intrigued by that, simply because actually, as you've actually been predicting quite accurately, Chris Snowdon, that they come for the drugs, they come for the cigarettes, and then it moves on to the alcohol, and then it moves on to the sugar tax. And when it starts being the stuff that I consume and that I enjoy, my drugs of choice, then I start getting unhappy about it. So I can absolutely see that creeping argument where at some point we are going to actually have the state just telling us every single thing we can and can't put into our mouths or into our veins or into our lungs. And I can certainly see the argument. And I think that argument is winning. I think the move towards cannabis legalisation is coming at a bizarre time. So we're going to have legalised cannabis at the same time we basically outlaw sugar, which is going to be a really, really strange state of affairs.
And what did we make? Because there was a YouGov survey this week, or probably last week by the time people listen to this, that by 53 to 32% British people now support legalisation of cannabis. More Tory voters are for it and against it. What do we make of this kind of shift in attitudes?
When do we see the arguments against that? It's, an old fuddy-duddy like me saying, I don't think this is a good idea. And everyone else, you've got every pop star, every film star, every woke politician, everyone's saying, look, this is what we have to do. And so people aren't hearing the proper arguments on either side. I think we need to have a sensible, I know this is mad.
People don't know what they're voting for. You don't think we should ignore the will of the people?
No, we need an evidence-based debate, because we're constantly told, for instance, that, everyone does drugs. No, everyone doesn't do drugs. In the last years, under 7% of people in this country, most people in this country have never tried drugs. I count as somebody who's tried drugs by, trying a spliff a couple of times when I was 16 and not enjoying it. So I do think that a lot of people's views are based on being given by people who've never even used the stuff. And Chris is giving me such a filthy look right now.
Just before we punch out this section, Chris, what do you think the prospects actually are in the near term? Do you think this is something that is reaching that kind of critical mass, or is it people overhyping these recent survey
I'm not
results?
sure where Lammy et al. Got this 5 to 10 years figure. I mean, I really think there's way too many moving parts to predict when it's going to happen. I do think it will probably happen because it seems to have been largely a success in North America and elsewhere. A European country will follow suit in the next 10 years. I'm fairly sure of that. But I'm doubtful whether it'll be Britain unless Boris decides to really go for it. But a lot depends on who the Prime Minister is and what the government is. But definitely there's momentum behind this. This YouGov poll was pretty interesting. Public opinion really does seem to be shifting for whatever reason. So I think it will happen, but I'd be surprised if we're the first European country to go for it.
I would think definitely in 10 years' time it would be far more likely, perhaps not 5 years. But yeah, I've been intrigued to see how it does come about. But I think that's going to have to come about with just a general relaxation of sort of government finger wagging and interference in our lives.
It would be a cool kind of hard Brexit thing to do. So just suddenly open up. We're already the biggest producer of medical cannabis in the world. If we then become like this, we could basically attract people from Europe on cannabis tourism trips and all that kind of stuff. I think it'd send quite a good message out to the rest of the world.
I can understand why Canada wanted to do it. I mean, I think if I was living in Canada, I'd want to be on drugs.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. And if you are, why not take a second to leave us a rating and a review with your podcast provider? It takes just 30 seconds and is a great way to help us reach new people. Now, on with the show. Let's move on to our second topic of the day, which is tobacco and a smoke-free England, or the prospect of a smoke-free England by 2030. So this was one of the things that our now former PM, Theresa May, hopes will be part of a legacy as part of a kind of desperate attempt in the final few days in office to be remembered for something other than making a dog's dinner of Brexit. May was firing out papers and proposals. There was even legislation. There was the net zero carbon target, of course, this new office for burning injustices. But most interestingly for this podcast, there was a green paper which announced this intention of the government to achieve a smoke-free England by 2030. It's a little light on the details. The paper says that the government intends to issue some sort of ultimatum to industry to end smoked tobacco. But is this where we're heading, and is that such a bad thing? Could we see e-cigarettes being promoted to leave burning tobacco behind for good? Or is it something more kind of authoritarian that's in the offing? Chris, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Something authoritarian, I think, inevitably, if they're going to try and push through with this. I'm really sick of prime ministers trying to build themselves a legacy for a start-off, and Theresa May's
just
been
full stop.
Yeah, I honestly think that everyone who takes over should just bin everything that was suggested in the previous 6 months by their predecessor, because it's always bad news. You had the Equalities Act was Harriet Harman's thing in 2010. You just threw in there to knacker up the next government. And a lot of the assault on free speech is a result of that. The smoking ban itself, if you remember, was actually one of Tony Blair's legacy things. He was very nervous about doing it, and he actually quit, I think, only about a week before the smoking ban came in. Probably a coincidence, I don't know, but that was a legacy thing. Let's have a big bold move, and if it really doesn't work out, then Gordon Brown will be in charge when it happens. And this, the Department for Tackling Injustice, it's just unbelievable. How does that differ from the Ministry of Justice, for a start off? I don't know. But yeah, so the prohibition in 2030, they haven't quite called it about that, but they have said in this green paper that they expect the tobacco industry to make cigarettes obsolete by 2030. So I don't see how that's much different to prohibition. I mean, for a start, they don't understand how markets work. If they think that it's up to the tobacco industry to decide whether people start smoking or not. So long as there is demand there, the tobacco industry will continue to serve it. And if the existing tobacco companies stop making cigarettes, some other company will come along and make it. And if all the companies are banned from making cigarettes, the black market will supply it. So although it's vaguely conceivable that by the year 2030, nobody will choose to smoke anymore. Everyone will be on vape devices or some kind of even more high-tech version of safe nicotine delivery devices. It's very unlikely, because I know people who've tried every nicotine product under the sun and they just like smoking, and they're well aware of the risks, and they're adults and they just want to keep smoking. And what's the tobacco industry going to do about that? What's the government going to do about that, other than to have this target, which really is not that far away? 11 years away is not that far. But this is how things work these days. It's like with the net zero thing. You get these idiot politicians just virtue signaling. I hate to overuse that word, but it's pure virtue signaling when you're setting some target and saying, well, this is what I'd like the world to be like. And I'm off now, but I'm setting this target for some years hence. And somebody's going to have to work out the detail of how we go about doing it. This is not the first time it's happened. Scotland has a tobacco-free target of something like 2034. Finland has something similar. New Zealand has something similar. All these targets are brought in usually without any kind of public discussion whatsoever. And everyone forgets about them because it doesn't seem like it has any real policy relevance until you get closer and closer to it. And it's as we get closer to 2030, you'll hear all the groups saying, well, the government is committed to doing this. We're going to have to move much faster. We're going to have to do this. And it will ultimately, I think, involve prohibition, which everyone knows is a failure, as we've just been discussing. But
Julia, what's your thoughts on
I'm an anti-smoking Nazi, I have to say, as someone genuinely. Congress is just going to start kicking me at this point. The smoking ban came in 2007. As not only as an ex-waitress and barmaid and having to put up with it for years and years, people blowing smoke in my faces when they're ordering their pint, but also I'm a bit heavily pregnant pretty much the whole way through 2006, not being able to ever go to a pub to watch only I think it was the World Cup matches that year, or European Championships, I can't remember.
World Cup.
But I don't know, I couldn't watch it in the pub. I had to watch it at home alone because I couldn't be around smoke, because I just genuinely just made me sick. So I've got to be honest, I really welcomed the smoking ban, but I think there's a very big difference between saying I don't want people to smoke in places where it's going to impinge on other people who are working in places, and also people just be able to enjoy a drink and a meal without being basically covered in other people's smoke. And I know it's done terrible damage to the pub industry, but I think there are still arguments in favour of that. When it comes to people being able to buy a product, if we've said it's a legal product, presumably if it's a prohibition, they're going to make it illegal. I actually say this product is illegal. And it's quite obvious that A, that wouldn't work, because we know how, as you say, prohibition works. And B, it's not even necessary. The smoking rate is plummeting, largely thanks to vaping, rather than, to a certain extent, as a result of taxation over the years. But there does come a point when you tax cigarettes so much, 80%, as we mentioned earlier, of the tax, of the cost of a packet of fags now is tax, in which case it's made the black market cigarettes off the back of a lorry much more attractive. But it seems to me that we are, with the introduction of vaping, people are going to gradually move off cigarettes anyway. It's actually quite rare now to be surrounded by people who are smoking, unless you're outside an office or a train station. Everyone's getting their cigarette because, before they're going to have to face 2 hours without one. Smoking is going down in all social classes, both genders, or all 17 genders, depending on how woke you're feeling today. All age groups. And it is going down. It is, I think, naturally going to die out. There's no need to prohibit it. And what I find extraordinary is that the campaigns about smoking, they don't, and certainly not just in this country, other countries, they don't actually push vaping as the solution to the problem. Vaping's not ideal. Clearly there are going to be some risks attached, as there are to anything that we do. There's a risk attached to eating cheese, for God's sake. But it does seem to me that the fact that the public health bodies haven't welcomed vaping with open arms as the way to stop people dying from lung cancer from smoking and as the obvious solution, I think is a little bit telling, because if you want to stop what's wrong with smoking, you should surely be at the first phase encouraging people to vape instead, and then working on that if that's what you want to do. But certainly the failure to promote vaping.
To be fair, in this country they've been pretty good at promoting it. Elsewhere, at the moment in the USA they're having a war on Juul in particular, which just defies belief. You've got people going around, supposed experts going around saying vaping is worse for you than smoking.
Which it patently isn't.
Well, clearly not, and no serious scientist thinks anything like that. But in Britain, to be fair, Public Health England and ASH have been fairly sound on vaping, have encouraged even actually encouraged offices to allow people to vape at work. So we've been better than pretty much any other country from that point of view. But of course, these groups are also now very much behind this 2030 target, which goes contrary to the whole idea of allowing the market to move and allowing people to voluntarily choose.
Well, they also
vaping.
make cigarettes cool again, because one of the things about having people instead of... I have very vivid memories of my teenage years of sitting in coffee bars and bars, and, the guys I dated, the cool guys with their Marlboro packs on the table. And although I really don't like smoking, I always just... They looked really cool. I associated it as something cool. Now you only really see people, doing that sort of, standing looking a bit cold and shivery in the rain outside their office going... getting the vape, and it's definitely not as cool, or even cool at all anymore. Certainly to my almost teenager, they just think smoking's just a really weird thing that people do. If you prohibit it, you're just going to make it much cooler again, aren't you?
I think probably so, yeah.
The sort of thing that Chris will start doing. He tries to be down with the kids.
It was interesting though, Chris, because also going back to the smoking ban, because as Julie was saying, there was around the time of that a very kind of harm principle argument in relation to the smoking ban. People don't want to be exposed to secondhand smoke. We could go into the whole secondhand smoke discussion, but let's not for a second. But was it always the case that was always a bit of a lie? Very quickly it became about this project of denormalisation. Maybe you shouldn't smoke in parks. Maybe you shouldn't smoke in beaches. Is this kind of this smoke-free target just revealing the fact this wasn't ever really about not imposing your choice on other people? It is just about us.
Yeah, that's exactly, and that's one of the most irritating things about it, is that over the whole period of anti-smoking agitation going back 20 or 30 years, it's all been based on lies, really. Anybody with any sense knew that these people were prohibitionists and didn't want anybody to smoke because they didn't think it was good for people. But they've always used these kind of dodgy arguments that kind of relate maybe to the harm principle or to market failures. And they'll say, oh, well, it's about the children. We don't want children. You know, if children see these packets, then they might want to smoke. If children see advertising, they might want to smoke. Therefore, we've got to ban the advertising. And we don't mind, of course. If people want to smoke, that's up to them. We're last people to be judgmental about anybody who wants to smoke. You want to smoke in the privacy of your own home, so long as you're not blowing smoke in my face, that's fine. That's up to you. And now it's finally turned. Now we got to the point in the final phase of this crusade in which they can openly say, smoking's bad for you, we don't like it, and there will be no more smoking on my watch. There is no excuse for what's been proposed in this green paper along the lines of anything to do with passive smoking or the costs of the NHS or children or anything. They're not even pretending. They're just saying, even if you're on your own in the middle of a field in a gale smoking a cigarette, that is intolerable, and we will put a stop to it.
And you are a bad person as well. It's amazing how much the ground has shifted on this, though, because I can remember I was at the political editor of the Sunday Express, gosh, many, many years ago, and it would have been around the 2000 time, and I remember we did a front page story, and it was something, a leaked document from a committee meeting in the London Mayor's office about how they were looking to ban smoking in London, and the amount of abuse and ridicule I took from other political editors, like, for God's sake, what a load of absolute nonsense. Yeah, well, 6-7 years on, it was banned across the country to all intents and purposes in public places. So I think that going back to the conversation we just had about cannabis, I think we're more likely to see a ban on cigarettes and on tobacco, on sales of cigarettes in this country before we'll see legalisation of cannabis. And it will be bizarre if those two things, in a way, end up going hand in hand, because I do think that public health lobby are just sort of out of control. They've got billions in funding and they are just pushing this. The medical establishment is behind them, and there is this sort of rather there's a certain religious zeal about it now. And my view is, look, I don't smoke. I don't really like being around people who smoke. As long as they're not blowing it in my face and they're not putting cigarette butts on the street, or frankly, smoking next to a small child, I can live with it. I'd rather they didn't, but it's not really my business. They might not like what I'm doing, so I can live with it. And I think most people can, but I think the public health zealots go rather further. For them, it's not just smoking is bad. It's almost that you're a bad person if you smoke. God knows what they think of you, Chris. Mind you, gave us smoking onto the vape pen.
Not your biggest fan.
I will start smoking again if I ban it.
I told you, he'll be one of the cool kids.
Last Orders, like all of Spike's podcasts, is free. There are no subscriptions, bonus episodes for paying customers. We want to reach as many people as possible. But to help us do so, we rely on the generosity of our listeners. So if you enjoy the show and have a bit of money to spare, please do consider making a donation. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. Now, back to the show. So finally, let's move on to our last topic, and Irn-Bru. So the maker of Irn-Bru, AG Bar, has warned of a 20% drop in its annual profits after being hit in part by the impact of last year's sugar tax. AG Bar famously changed the secret recipe of its flagship kind of rust-hued fizzy drink to reduce its sugar content before the new tax came in. It dodged the sugar levy, therefore, but it's become at a huge cost, effectively robbing Scotland of its famously favourite fizzy drink overnight and sparking a huge amount of outrage in the process. I tend to think if Boris Johnson just demanded that AG Bar reinstate the original Irn-Bru, he could probably turn his fortunes around in Scotland overnight. But Chris, what do you think this particular announcement tells us about the sugar tax and how that's all panning out?
Go broke again, isn't it? It's more Schadenfreude. It's just like when we were talking about Jamie Oliver a couple of months ago.
This has become like the Schadenfreude section.
Good. We need to finish on an uplifting note, don't we? And AG Bar's share price going into, I think it dropped about 30%, and it's still way down there, is great news because, well, firstly, the Irn-Bru reformulation is the only one that's really affected me because I never liked Lucozade, and Ribena you can just about get away with if you just put more concentrate in. But the Irn-Bru really is horrible. I used to really like Irn-Bru. I know a lot of people down south don't really ever touch it, but it's kind of my second or third favourite fizzy drink, or used to be. And Rubicon is up there as well. I don't drink much Rubicon, but every now and again I'll have a can. I made the mistake a couple of weeks ago of buying one. Oh, God. I could taste this horrible artificial sweetener taste for about 2 hours afterwards. So they've wrecked Rubicon, the same company, by the way. Bars make both. And for quite a while after the sugar tax and after this reformulation, despite the fact that everybody who drank it on Twitter was saying this is an absolute disgrace, what are you doing? There was a lot of good news stories slipping out in the papers. Around about a year ago, there were a lot of headlines saying, AG Bar are prospering under their new reformulated drinks, and they've dodged the sugar tax, and everything's looking good, and the share price is going up. But it was all clearly, if you kind of read the article properly, it was based largely on sales data from before the sugar tax came in, when obviously people were not only buying Irn-Bru in unusual amounts, but actually stockpiling it because they knew that this new version was coming out. So
I looked it up, and apparently you can now buy a crate of it for £75 on the internet.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, there is still some available apparently on eBay.
That's what I do with light bulbs. They still work.
So of course they were doing well. Of course they were selling lots of Irn-Bru, and only a couple of weeks ago did the chickens really come home to roost, and they are predicting a huge drop in revenues and profits this year. And as I say, the share price went into a nosedive.
Well, this is where we should say all hail to Coca-Cola for refusing to change their... Now, this is where I'm on much more comfortable ground with you, Chris, because again, this is about nanny state that affects my stuff that I consume. I mean, hey, if they start going for Sancerre, seriously, there'll be riots on the streets. That's all I'm saying. I've had, I think, one Irn-Bru, a sip of one Irn-Bru once in my life, and I thought it was absolutely disgusting, I have to say. However, this same company do make Funkin' Pro cocktail mixes. I cannot recommend these enough. Their mojito mix is absolutely
Have
awesome.
they been reformulated?
No, because they're basically sugar, right, as all cocktail mixes are, which is why they taste alcohol and sugar. What's not to like? If you could put chocolate in there as well, you're onto a winner. But this is the thing. Look, as a mum as well, I'm thinking as mum, if I go to buy a cereal that is advertised as like, a healthy cereal with all the added vitamins and things, I would rather it didn't have sort of like a tablespoon of sugar in every portion. And I see these mums, especially my terribly woke Waitrose near where these really sort of lefty right on mums are buying fruit strings and things for their kids. Like, those aren't fruit strings, they're sugar strings, no added sugar. No, it's literally all sugar. It's just not added sugar. It's just the product it's made from is made of sugar.
Honest sugar, as Jamie Oliver would call it.
Honest sugar, exactly. So I really object to sugar being in stuff that I don't think it would be in. So I would have to look at the packet and think, well, why is there sugar in bread, for God's sake? I've made bread, didn't have a load of sugar in it. So but when you're buying something like a sweet fizzy drink or chocolate or a cake or whatever, I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think it should have sugar in it. It's expected to have sugar in it. It's a crucial ingredient. Sometimes I might have a Diet Coke because that's what I feel like. Sometimes, let's be honest, and there have been a few hangovers from weddings lately, a real Coke is the only thing that will do. And I want to go full sugar, full throttle, but I know what I'm buying. And given that there are so many options on the market, if you don't want to put on weight, if you don't want your kids to have low sugar, there are 1,000 diet drinks available. There are 1,000 low sugar options available. Buy one of those. The idea that an entire industry should be told to reconstitute their recipes because, I don't know, some anti-sugar Nazi doesn't like it, I find it utterly bizarre. I'm amazed that the food companies and drink companies have given into it. I'm amazed at the British public haven't said, no, enough.
Well, they have, effectively.
They're not buying it. But they haven't said to the government. It's the government that's forcing them to do it. There's no point being angry at whoever makes Irn-Bru.
No, but the market will decide, and I think there must be people in Irn-Bru now having a bit of a rethink about this, same as at Lucozade, which, by the way, are just advertising like crazy at the moment. I've been on the tube to get here, and every stop had some big Lucozade up, and they are trying their best with millions of pounds to get people to drink this stuff, and no one ever is, I don't think.
They just move on to the more sugary
these
versions.
guys, they've got the recipe, right? They've got the recipe, which they could relaunch at any time. They see themselves losing tens of millions of pounds.
Well, what are they
Surely
afraid of,
somebody
then?
must be thinking, why don't we put out Irn-Bru Classic? Just like Coke did in 1985 when New Coke died. Months later, Coca-Cola Classic, it's out.
Why do you think they don't? Is there just so much pressure? And is there sort of like, well, if you don't do this voluntarily, we are going to clobber you?
In the case of Lucozade, it seems to be the guy who runs Lucozade, Robina Suntory, genuinely believes in all this stuff, and he's on the record as saying that he used to feel so guilty when Jamie Oliver came on TV, and he used to get all the parents staring him at the school gates, and he just felt he could not continue living this life. Hopefully, this guy will get sacked eventually. Again, the market
Well, he will,
decide.
won't he? Because ultimately, that he has to make a good for his shareholders.
You would think so, yeah.
Not for
and it's a
keeping
Japanese
public health
company.
England.
They don't really care about sugar and all this kind of stuff. They're pretty hard-nosed about it. In the case of Irn-Bru, I honestly don't know, but I do suspect with a lot of these people in the food and drink industry, we probably forget of how, about how cozy relationships are within the whole kind of political sphere. And I think there's probably a lot of dinner parties and private meetings going on. And of course, the government is exerting a certain amount of pressure. I know Public Health England were very upset with Coca-Cola that they didn't reformulate Coke. And I'm sure they get a pat on the back when they do things like this. But ultimately, in industry, a pat on the back does not pay the bills. And I suspect at some point, if things continue like this with Irn-Bru, that they will relaunch a classic. They have relaunched a Rubicon Deluxe, which is basically the old Rubicon. So I think we might see a bit of backpedaling on this kind of stuff, hopefully.
Is there any evidence as well about if the sugar tax has worked on any kind of level yet? Has there been anything that's come out about whether it's hit consumption or anything like that? Or, 'cause I know when Mexico introduced their soda tax a while ago, a year after consumption had actually gone up slightly.
It was basically the same. It neither went up nor down, really, although various studies claimed it did.
I wouldn't even know what a can of drink costs. I mean, if I let's face it, not just need a fizzy drink, whether it's 85p or 60p or a quid.
It varies enormously.
But also it varies whether it's in the local newsagent, in the supermarket, a pack of 6, or whether you're buying it, from a stall at the cinema. So I think most people aren't even aware of what the price mark is or what it's supposed to be.
I think that's exactly right. It's either like £1.80 for a bottle or it's 69p for a can, and
But isn't there evidence though that actually when you put up the prices of these things, the idea is, and again, the minimum alcohol pricing in Scotland as well. When you put these, people are going to buy this stuff anyway, and it just means they've got people on low incomes. My income, I couldn't care less whether it's a quid or 2 quid or 50p. It don't make any difference to me. And most of the people making these decisions, but people on low incomes, they're going to buy it anyway, and then they're just going to have less money to spend on. Let's face it, the Brussels sprouts.
It's a relatively small amount of money if you look at it, but of course it will escalate if we start taxing other things, which is what the chief medical officer wants to do. But isn't that the thing? Is actually
these a low tax like sugar tax doesn't actually make a difference. It only makes a difference when you have it up at say 50% plus
levels.
And cigarette levels. And at that point, British people. I mean, surely at some point the British people will say enough already. We have seen that it's extraordinary. One of the reasons why we've got obesity is people can afford food. People used to really struggle to be able to afford to buy food for many decades of the last century, and actually the food prices relative to household income have gone down massively. So people can actually there are many, being able to afford to be fat is quite a privilege. Let's all stop pretending it's poverty related. It's not. It's choice related. But the reality is that we're actually going to make it more expensive for people to live. And all the arguments you hear these days about, well, terrible thing if Brexit happened, or terrible if this happened, or what happened, all about how we're going to make people. It's going to be more expensive for people to live. At the same time as having a government that is putting up taxes
cost of living,
as a deliberate choice to make life more expensive for people, which is utterly bizarre.
And are we confident now that we've got Boris Johnson in number 10, who has already criticised the planned milkshake tax, has also been quite critical of sin taxes in general? Any confidence that might spark a rollback in any of these?
No, I don't have any confidence that what he says on one day doesn't necessarily lead to what he would do on another day.
He also did it. I think he introduced the sugar tax
in London when he became London mayor?
Was it just in the City of London building? I think actually in the mayor's office. But
you can't be too confident. I think he'll be better than Theresa May.
I think the people surrounding him are very much more of the libertarian.
Well, let's
face it, you at the Institute of Economic Affairs have been creaming yourselves for the last week at the excitement of having all these libertarians moving into government.
I know we do. We just lost one of our staff to Liz Truss.
Sounded like she'd eaten her, but she's still alive. But
they've got some pretty sound people. And I don't think this will continue under Boris Johnson, but I made some quite positive predictions about Theresa May when she came in, so I'm not going to make that mistake
on this podcast.
Again, I think with this soft drink thing, I think the market will ultimately teach businesses a lesson. The famous thing about Scotland with Irn-Bru was it was the only country in the world where Coca-Cola was not the best-selling soft drink. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes at some point. That would be a big deal if that changes, and they'll have to backpedal. I haven't seen any actual sales data as such. Nor have I seen any data on sugar consumption since the sugar tax came in. Presumably it has gone down, but it's been going down for a long time, and sugary drink consumption has been falling enormously fast.
And that's because people become more aware and there are more options as well. It just seems to me, it's one thing that people are wanting from this new government is, could you just get out of what I'm doing or what I'm choosing to do, and could you stop other bad things happening to me? The idea that we should be terribly, terribly worried about teenagers consuming fizzy drinks as opposed to teenagers going out on the streets and getting stabbed. I know which one I'm more worried about. And I know that's what most parents are more worried about. And I think it's sort of, could you deal with the really bad stuff and let the parents worry about the other stuff?
Yeah, go on, Boris.
I think it's a great place to end it. Julia, Chris, thank you very much. You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Do give us a rating, a review, and even a donation if you can afford it. We'll be back next month, but in the meantime, you can read Spiked every day at spiked-online.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.